I remember the first time I understood what silence meant. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence that wraps around you like a blanket on a cold soul morning when you're still half dreaming and the world hasn't yet demanded anything of you. I mean the other kind. The silence that comes after a crash. After the sound of knuckles meeting something soft. After my mother's voice disappeared mid-sentence, swallowed by a gasp so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. I was 8 years old the first time I saw my father hit her. I didn't understand it then. I told myself I'd misread it, that the movement of his hand had been something else, that the red that bloomed on my mother's cheek was a trick of the kitchen light, that the way she turned away from me and busied herself with the dishes was just her way, her quiet way. My mother, Park Young-sun, was a woman built of quiet things. Quiet smiles. Quiet meals set on the table with precision. Quiet footsteps that learned over years to navigate the minefield of my father's moods. My name is Choi Sang-hoon. I am 28 years old now. I am a boxing champion. And this is the story of how I became both the man I swore I'd be and a man I never imagined I could become. But before I can tell you about the ring, before I can tell you about the crowds and the sweat and the glory, before I can tell you about him, I have to tell you about Park Dong-soo. My father. The first monster I ever met. He was an alpha, my father. Broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, with the kind of presence that filled a room whether you wanted it to or not. When I was very young, before I understood the machinery of our world, the hierarchy of alpha, beta, and omega, the unspoken laws of dominance and submission, I thought his size meant strength. I thought the heaviness of his voice meant wisdom. I thought the way other people stepped aside for him on the street was respect. It wasn't. It was fear. And fear, I learned, wears many faces. My father lost his job at the construction firm when I was 9. He'd had the position for years, foreman, well-paid, respected by the men beneath him. But his temper had always been a live wire, sparking and dangerous, and eventually it connected with something that couldn't be undone. He struck a colleague. Then his supervisor. The details changed depending on who told the story, but the ending was always the same. He came home on a Tuesday afternoon with the particular stillness of a man who has burned down something that could not be rebuilt, and from that day forward, the walls of our apartment in Incheon became smaller. He didn't look for another job. Not seriously. He made gestures, left the apartment in the mornings with the purposeful stride of a man with somewhere to be, came back hours later smelling of cigarettes and the particular sweetness of cheap soju, sat in front of the television with the remote control held like a scepter. My mother worked double shifts at the restaurant where she waitressed. She came home with her feet swollen, her uniform smelling of fried fish and sesame oil, and she handed over her earnings every week without complaint. Any day she didn't have enough, he hit her. I won't dwell too long in those years. Not because they don't matter, they matter enormously, they are the bedrock of everything I am, but because I have spent a great deal of my adult life learning that to live inside those memories for too long is to give my father a victory he doesn't deserve. What I will say is this: by the time I was 12, I had become an expert in reading the atmosphere of a room. I could gauge my father's mood from the sound of the front door closing. I could calculate the risk in a single glance, the set of his jaw, the angle of his shoulders, the particular quality of his breathing. I positioned myself, unconsciously at first and then very deliberately, between him and my mother whenever possible. I was small for my age at 12. Wiry. My mother used to cup my face in her hands and tell me I was beautiful. Pale skin, sharp jaw, the kind of deep-set eyes that she said came from her side of the family. "You look like me," she'd whisper, and she'd smile the way she only smiled when my father wasn't home, like the sun coming out from behind a building. I didn't care what I looked like. I cared that I was too small to stop him. So I grew. I ate everything I could. I did push-ups in my bedroom until my arms gave out. I watched videos on the old computer at the school library, boxing matches, martial arts demonstrations, anything that showed me how a body could be turned into something capable of defending itself. I was 13 when I asked my homeroom teacher about boxing gyms in the area. She gave me a look I didn't fully understand until years later, the look of an adult who sees something terrible in a child's eyes and doesn't know what to do with it. She gave me the address of a gym 20 minutes from our apartment. I didn't tell my mother. I went on a Saturday while my father was at a mahjong parlor burning through money we didn't have, and I stood outside the Incheon Boxing Academy for a full 10 minutes before I walked in. The smell hit me first, sweat and leather and floor cleaner and something underneath it all that I can only describe as effort. The sound of gloves against bags. The rhythm of jump ropes. The sharp exhale of men pushing through pain. The trainer was a retired professional named Coach Beck. He was a beta, mid-50s, short and compact with hands like cinder blocks and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He looked at me for a long moment when I introduced myself, this 13-year-old alpha child with the carefully blank face and the coiled tension that I didn't yet know I was carrying, and he said, "You're angry." I said, I want to learn how to fight. He said, not the same thing. But come back Monday. I came back Monday. I came back every day after that. The gym became the truest home I had. More than the apartment where my mother flinched at sudden noises. More than the school where I was quiet and watchful and got decent grades through sheer stubbornness. At the gym I had a purpose, a direction for everything inside me that had no other outlet. Coach Beck was a hard man but a fair one, and he recognized early that I was not a child dabbling in a hobby. I was a child with a mission. He trained me accordingly. 2 years I spent learning the fundamentals. 4. Defense. The geometry of angles. How to breathe through pain. How to think when every instinct tells you to react. And slowly, incrementally, my body began to become what I needed it to be. The wiry boy filled out into something harder, leaner, with shoulders that broadened and hands that grew accustomed to impact. I was 15 when Coach Beck told me I had genuine talent. Real potential. The kind that could go somewhere if I committed entirely. I was 15 when everything else changed too. Hello guys, welcome to Mimiel. Before we dive into this story, note this is an original work of Mimiel. If seen in another channel that is not Mimiel, please report that channel for impersonation and copyrights. Please don't forget to subscribe, comment, share and like for more stories like this. Now let's continue. The night my father nearly killed my mother, I was at the gym late. A Friday. I'd stayed after hours with Coach Beck's permission to work on my jab. I came home at 9:30 in the evening and the door was unlocked, which was wrong. My mother always locked the door, a habit ground into her by anxiety, and the light in the living room was on and my father was not there but my mother was on the kitchen floor. I won't describe what I found. I won't do that to her or to myself or to you. I called the emergency services. I rode in the ambulance holding her hand. I sat in the hospital corridor for 6 hours while strangers worked to put my mother back together. And when the doctor came out and told me she would survive, I felt two things simultaneously. A relief so enormous it almost knocked me off the plastic chair I was sitting on, and a cold, crystalline fury that settled into my bones like it intended to stay there forever. My father was arrested that night. He knew how to disappear when things got bad, but the neighbors had called the police and there were witnesses, and for once, for this one devastating, overdue once, the machinery of justice moved. My mother was in the hospital for 3 weeks. During that time I stayed with Coach Beck and his wife, who fed me and said nothing about the bruise on my forearm from where my father had grabbed me when I tried to push between them earlier that week. When my mother was discharged, she filed for divorce. She took me with her. We moved to a small apartment in a different district of Seoul, somewhere my father wouldn't easily find us, somewhere we could start assembling something that looked like a life. Before the dust had even settled, my father's threats began. Messages through intermediaries. Whispered warnings from people we thought were friends. He knows where you are. He says if you don't drop the divorce, he'll. I was 15 years old. I stood in the kitchen of our new apartment and looked at my mother's face, still healing, still tender with the evidence of what she had survived, and I made a promise to myself that I have kept every single day since. I would become the most dangerous man in any room I walked into. I would build myself into something my father could never touch. I would stand between him and my mother like a wall he could not break through, and I would do it with my own 2 hands, built up from nothing, built up from everything he had failed to be. I went back to the gym the next morning. The years between 15 and 28 are not a blur, exactly. I remember them with the particular clarity that I think comes from having lived them so intentionally, so purposefully, that every day felt like a brick laid in a structure I was building towards something. But there is a momentum to those years that is hard to fully convey. I fought. I trained. I won. I lost. I trained harder. I won more. By 18 I had my first amateur title in the junior division. By 21 I had turned professional under Coach Beck's management and a sponsor he'd cultivated for years, a sports agency in Seoul that saw something in me worth investing in. By 24 I was ranked 4th nationally in my weight class. By 26 I was ranked 1st. I won the Korea Boxing Federation Championship on a Thursday night in a stadium in central Seoul, in front of 12,000 people, in the 5th round of a fight with a man named Oh Jae-hyun who hit like a demolition crane and had never been stopped before. I stopped him. I remember standing in the center of the ring with the referee holding my wrist and the crowd making a sound like the ocean in a storm, and I thought of my mother. I thought of 15-year-old me in that hospital corridor. I thought about the promise. My mother was at ringside. She cried. I don't cry easily. I learned a long time ago to keep my face very still, to present a surface that gives nothing away, but I held her in the dressing room afterward and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known I'd been holding. I was 28 years old. I was, by most measures of the word that mattered to me, successful. My mother was safe. She had a comfortable apartment that I paid for, a small flower shop she ran that she loved, a life that was genuinely hers. My father had served time for the assault, and since his release had stayed away, deterred by the combination of my public profile and the restraining order my mother had maintained. I thought that was enough. I thought I had what I needed. I lived for boxing. I trained 6 days a week. I socialized sparingly, wary of people who wanted proximity to a champion rather than anything genuine. I was selective about who I spent time with, guarded about who I let close. I had a reputation in the boxing world for being formidable and somewhat cold, not cruel, people generally said, but contained. Impossible to read. The one thing I was unequivocal about in any conversation that ventured there was my position on alphas. I didn't trust them. I didn't admire them. The world was structured to tell alpha men that they were naturally superior, more dominant, more capable, more deserving, and every piece of evidence my life had provided me suggested that the only thing alpha dominance reliably produced was damage. My father had been an alpha. The men he ran with had been alphas. The particular ugliness of an alpha who believed his designation gave him permission to take, to control, to harm, I had seen it up close and I wanted no part of it. I was an alpha myself. I knew that. I could feel the instincts, the drive, the biological architecture of what I was. I just chose to govern it very differently. I chose to turn everything that the alpha designation might have made me toward the labor of protecting rather than dominating. And when people asked about relationships, and they did ask, journalists, teammates, the occasional well-meaning person in my orbit, I said simply that I wasn't interested. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And then came the night of the Hangang Championship, and everything began to shift in a direction I had absolutely not planned for. The Hangang Championship was a prestige event, not a title fight for me since I'd already held the national title for 2 years, but a showcase bout with international attention, the kind of fight that expanded profiles and opened doors to international promoters. My opponent was a Thai fighter with an impressive record and a style that would require me to make adjustments. I'd prepared thoroughly. I was focused. I remember the night clearly. The arena was capacity. The lights had that particular quality that I'd always loved. The way the ring itself became the only illuminated thing in the world when you were inside it, everything beyond the ropes receding into a roaring dark. I was in the 3rd round, controlling the center, when I became aware of someone watching me. I am accustomed to being watched in the ring. That is, after all, rather the point. But this was different. There is a quality of certain gazes, a weight, a specificity, that registers even through the noise and the adrenaline and the complete cognitive dedication that a fight requires. I noticed it for a fraction of a second, a kind of pricking awareness along the back of my neck, and then I dismissed it and went back to work. I won in the 7th round. A knockout. The crowd went appropriately magnificent. In the dressing room afterward, while I was still unwrapping my hands and my body was still humming with the particular electricity of a finished fight, Coach Beck came in with the expression of a man who has a piece of news he isn't entirely sure how to deliver. "There's someone who wants to meet you," he said. "Promoter?" I asked. We'd had several approach after this fight. "Not exactly." He paused. "Kim Dan." I looked at him. Coach Beck was not an easily unnerved man. He'd spent 30 years in professional boxing, navigating everything from fixed fights to shady management to the occasional criminal element that skirted around the edges of the sport. But there was something in the way he said that name that made me set down the hand wrap and pay full attention. "The Kim Dan," I said. Everyone in South Korea knew the name. Not from the newspapers necessarily, the newspapers were careful about Kim Dan. But there was a particular stratum of knowledge that moved through certain circles, through the world of sports and business and the elegant shadows where legal and illegal money mingled with practiced ease. Kim Dan. 33 years old. Heir to an empire that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, some of them visible and some of them very much not. Restaurants, hospitality, a significant stake in legitimate real estate, but also, allegedly, the kind of operations that occupied the minds of prosecutors and concerned no one who valued their continued good health. He was a mafia man. And more than that, he was something rarer and stranger. An enigma. An enigma. Even in the modern world, they were rare enough that most people half believed they were legend. The designation sat above Alpha in the hierarchy of the Omegaverse. Not an Omega, not merely dominant, but something categorically different. Enigmas could project pheromones powerful enough to affect Alphas. They could dominate where Alphas merely led. They were, in the oldest mythologies of the Omegaverse, considered apex creatures. In reality, they were simply men and women who had been born with a particular biological signature that defied the usual categories. Most people had never met one. "He wants to meet me," I repeated. "Why?" Coach Beck looked at me for a moment with an expression I would come to understand only later. "He watched you fight," he said. "He watched you fight and apparently he very much liked what he saw." I did not meet Kim Dan that night. I was not in the habit of making myself available on short notice simply because someone wanted to see me, regardless of who that someone was. I told Coach Beck to thank him for his interest and send him away. Coach Beck did so with the expression of a man who suspected this would not, in fact, be the end of it. He was right. The flowers arrived 3 days later. Not roses, which would have been obvious. Not some expensive ostentatious arrangement selected to impress. A carefully considered collection of deep burgundy dahlias, white gardenia, and a single branch of blooming cherry blossom, delivered to the gym in a box with no card. They were exquisite. They were also, somehow, precisely the kind of flowers I might have chosen myself if I were the sort of person who chose flowers, which I wasn't. I asked the delivery man who sent them. He gave me a business card. Kim Dan, it read. Just the name. Just a phone number. Nothing else. I threw the card in the trash. I let the flowers stay in the gym because they were genuinely beautiful, and Coach Beck's wife had come to collect her husband for lunch and saw them and said they were lovely, and I didn't have the heart to throw them away after that. The next week, tickets arrived to a concert, a classical music performance I had mentioned in a passing interview several months ago that I would have liked to attend if I ever had time. The tickets were for a Friday evening. They were front row. There were 2. I sat with them in my hand for a long time. Then I threw those away too. But I thought about them. I thought about the specificity of it, someone who had listened to a throwaway comment in an interview and translated it into action. Someone paying attention in a way that was deliberate and particular. I told myself it was the behavior of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the sheer application of resources, and that it meant nothing about genuine attention or care. I was mostly convincing. It was the 4th week when he came to the gym himself. I was in the middle of a sparring session, working with a younger fighter on his defensive footwork, when the atmosphere of the room changed. There is no other way to describe it. The gym was noisy as it always was. The rhythm of bags, the sound of trainers calling corrections, the low conversation between athletes. And then there was a shift, like the air pressure had changed slightly, and I became aware of eyes on me before I saw who they belonged to. I finished the combination I was running, stepped back, and turned. Kim Dan was standing just inside the doorway. I had seen photographs, of course. The papers ran them occasionally with carefully worded captions about his business interests, his charitable contributions, his appearances at various high-profile events. In photographs he looked what he was, striking, immaculately presented, possessed of the kind of physical authority that photographs catch but don't quite contain. In person, standing in my gym in a dark coat over a perfectly fitted dark suit, his hair swept back from a face that was architecturally precise, high-bridged nose, strong jaw, eyes the particular dark color of deep water. He was something else entirely. He was looking directly at me. I pulled off one glove, then the other. I walked toward him with what I hoped was the precise blend of unhurried composure and clear territorial confidence that I used when I wanted to communicate, without words, that I was not impressed. This is a private facility, I said. Coach Beck gave me the access code, he said. His voice was even, measured, warm in a way that I immediately distrusted. I turned my head to look at Coach Beck across the gym, who was suddenly very interested in the ceiling. I turned back. I'm Kim Dan, he said, as though I didn't know. As though the entire room hadn't rearranged its energy around his arrival. I know who you are, I said. I also know what you are. I'm not interested. In meeting me? In anything you might want from me. He smiled. It was a restrained smile, not the wide performance of a man trying to charm, but something quieter, more specific. You don't know what I want. You're a mafia man, I said, keeping my voice level and below the hearing of the other fighters who were, with varying degrees of subtlety, watching us. Whatever it is, I want no part of it. I don't involve myself in underworld business. I'm not here about business. I studied him. He held the study with complete ease, neither combative nor ingratiating, just present, looking back at me with those dark, impossibly composed eyes. Then what are you here for? I asked. I watched you fight, he said, in the Hangang arena. And then I watched the footage of your previous 12 fights. And I found myself thinking that I haven't watched anyone in a very long time the way I watched you. Something in his voice made the back of my neck prickle. Not unpleasantly. I recognized the feeling, understood it biologically for what it was, and immediately placed a very firm internal door between that recognition and any possibility of acting on it. I'm flattered, I said in a tone carefully calibrated to communicate that I was not, in fact, flattered. But I don't associate with people in your line of work, I don't date, and I particularly don't. I looked him over once, deliberately, involve myself with alphas. He tilted his head. Just slightly. I'm not an alpha. I blinked. I'm sorry? I'm not an alpha, he repeated. Patient. Come. I looked at him. At the physical presence of him, the weight of authority in every line of his posture, the way the room had responded to his entrance. "You're not an alpha," I repeated. "No. You're a mafia lord with the energy of a man who's never been told no in his life, and you're telling me you're not an alpha." "I'm telling you I'm not an alpha," he confirmed. And there was that smile again, the quiet, contained one that somehow conveyed a depth of amusement far larger than its surface. I shook my head slowly. "You expect me to believe that?" "At some point," he said, "yes. But I'm patient." He left shortly after. No drama, no further pushing. He simply said it was good to meet me, that he hoped I'd consider allowing him to take me to dinner, and walked out with the same unhurried self-possession with which he'd entered. The gym felt slightly less dense after he left, like a held breath being released. Coach Beck materialized beside me with the expression of a man who wants to say something and isn't sure how to begin. "Don't," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were absolutely going to say something." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not what you think," he said finally. "I've known people who've dealt with him. He operates by his own code. Strange one, maybe, but—" "Coach," I said. "Right," he said. Not saying anything. I went back to training. But that prickling at the back of my neck stayed with me for the rest of the day. Over the following weeks and months, Kim Dan was a constant, unhurried presence at the edges of my life. He didn't push. That was the thing I found strangest. I had expected the approach of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Aggressive, escalating, leveraging the social weight of who he was to apply pressure I'd find difficult to refuse. Instead, he was simply present. He sent no more gifts after I made clear they were unwelcome. He appeared occasionally, at events where my presence was public, at a restaurant once where I'd gone with Coach Beck and 2 other fighters, at the gym a handful of times where he'd stay for 30 minutes and watch me work and say almost nothing. He did not flirt exactly. He made his interest clear but without the performance of it. When we spoke, and we did speak increasingly because he had the infuriating quality of being genuinely interesting once you stopped bracing for the angle, he listened. Actually listened, with the rare quality of attention that makes you feel like the entirety of a person's focus has been directed at you. I kept my walls up. I told him regularly and in various ways that whatever he thought this was, I wasn't interested. "You're an alpha," I said to him once, when we happened to be at the same public event, a charity sports gala, and he'd materialized beside me near the bar with the quiet inevitability that I was beginning, despite myself, to find less alarming than before. "We've discussed this," he said. He was looking out at the room rather than at me, which I had learned was a thing he did, gave me his profile rather than the full force of his attention, as though he understood that the full force was a lot to manage. "I told you I don't date alphas. And I told you I'm not an alpha. Kim Dan," I said. "Look at yourself." He turned then. Looked at me with those deep, still eyes. "What do you see?" he asked. "A man who walks into a room and it reorders itself around him," I said. "A man who has never, from what I can tell, been dominated by anything or anyone. A man who—" I stopped because I was about to say a man who makes every alpha instinct I have simultaneously stand down and go to full alert, and that was not a sentence I was prepared to say out loud to Kim Dan. He watched me not finish that sentence. He seemed to understand exactly what I'd stopped short of. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were warm in a way that I noticed despite my best efforts not to. "You think dominance is an alpha trait," he said. "Isn't it?" "Not exclusively." He paused. "The designation matters less than you think, Sang-hoon. What matters is what a person does with what they are." "Easy thing to say when you're at the top of every hierarchy that exists," I said. "Is that what you think? You're a Mafia Enigma who's never been stopped by anything in your life." "I've been stopped by you," he said quietly. 6 times. 7 now. I didn't have an immediate answer to that. He gave me a small nod, the particular courtesy of a man who knows when a conversation has reached its end, and moved away into the event. I stood at the bar and thought about the fact that he was right. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't used whatever he was to override my repeated refusals. He'd come back, yes, with a patience that was almost geological, but he had come back quietly, respectfully, without pressure. My father had been an alpha who believed his designation was a license. Kim Dan was something else entirely. I didn't know what to do with that. The months passed. December came, cold and sharp, and then January, and then the creeping warmth of a soul spring. I kept training. I kept fighting. I won 2 more bouts, one by decision, one by knockout in the 4th round that the sports media played over and over on highlight reels. My profile continued to grow. My life continued to be exactly what I had built it to be. And somewhere in those months, without my full conscious authorization, Kim Dan had become a fixture in my life that I had stopped trying to excise. We had dinner once. Just once, in the early spring, at his request at a restaurant I chose, with both of us on the understanding, my insistence, that it was not a date. We talked for 3 hours. I learned that he had read extensively about traditional Korean boxing history and wanted my perspective on the evolution of training methodology. I learned that he had a brother, younger, Beta, whom he clearly loved with a particular fierceness that I recognized because it was the same fierceness I felt for my mother. I learned that he was not, despite his business, a man who enjoyed violence for its own sake, that he found it, in fact, somewhat distasteful, which was a complexity in a man of his profession that I had not anticipated. He walked me to my car afterward. I drove home. I did not immediately acknowledge to myself that I had had a genuinely good evening. We had coffee twice after that. Then a walk along the Han River that somehow lasted 2 hours and ended with both of us standing at the river's edge talking about things I rarely talked about. My mother, the years when I was young, what those years had made me into. He listened. He didn't offer easy comfort or platitudes. He asked careful questions and accepted my answers without the reflexive pity that I hated, that always felt like its own small diminishment. You became what you needed, he said once. There's nothing to pity in that. There's everything to honor. I looked at the dark water of the Han. The lights of the city reflected in it, broken into shards by the current. My father is in jail, I said. Has been for 2 years since a parole violation. I don't know when they'll release him. When they do, Kim Dan said, I would like you to tell me. I turned to look at him. Not to interfere, he said. Just to know. I looked at him for a long moment. At the composed, precise lines of his face. At the way the city light caught his eyes. Why? I asked. He looked back at me steadily. Because what affects you matters to me, he said. Simply as that. Something moved in my chest. A shift. Like something that had been tightly wound loosening, fractionally, by a single turn. I looked back at the river. You're impossible, I said quietly. I've been called worse, he said. We stood there in the night air until the cold made it impractical to stand there any longer, and then we said good night and went our separate ways, and I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air on my face, needing the sensation of something moving against me to remind myself of what I was. But the shift had happened. And shifts I was learning don't unshift. He was released on a Wednesday. I found out on a Thursday morning, a phone call from my mother, her voice careful in the way that meant she was managing her own fear while trying not to alarm me. My father, Park Dong-soo, had been released on parole from Incheon Correctional Facility. He had been in for violation of the restraining order after my mother had filed a supplementary report. He had served the time. He was out. She told me she was fine. She told me the locks had been changed. She told me not to worry. I went to the gym and I trained until my body was empty. 3 hours. Coach Beck watched me with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and said nothing until I was done, at which point he handed me a towel and a water bottle and sat down on the bench beside me. Your mother? He asked. She's fine, I said. She says. She's strong, he said. She raised you. She's got your blood. The other way around, I said. I've got hers. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment and then stood and went to do whatever needed doing, and I sat in the empty gym with the towel over my head and the particular weight of 15 years of vigilance and 15 years of distance from that vigilance settled over me like weather. That night I was supposed to go home. I had training at 7 the next morning and I had the habit of good sleep, the professional boxer's understanding that the body requires maintenance. I drove away from the gym and I took a wrong turn somewhere, or maybe it wasn't wrong exactly, and I ended up in the Itaewon district in a bar I'd been to twice before with teammates, sitting in a corner with a whiskey I hadn't fully intended to order. I don't drink often. My body is my livelihood and my instrument and I respect it. But that night I found myself nursing the whiskey and then another, and the bar was loud and warm and nobody knew who I was there, or if they did, they left me alone with the social grace of people accustomed to seeing men who want to be left alone, and I sat with the noise and the warmth and the thing in my chest that I couldn't name, that was partly fear and partly old grief and partly something raw, something that had to do not with my father at all but with the conversation at the Han River and the way Kim Dan had looked at me and said what affects you matters to me simply as that. I was on my third whiskey when he appeared. I hadn't texted him. I hadn't called. But he sat down across from me in the booth as naturally as though we'd arranged to meet there, in his dark coat, his face carrying nothing more alarming than the particular quality of attention that I had, over these months, become grudgingly accustomed to. I looked at him. How did you know I was here? I didn't, he said. I come here sometimes. He gestured at the bar. The owner is a friend. I studied him for a moment, looking for the tell of a lie which I was good at reading, which boxing taught you, and found nothing that suggested he was being anything other than truthful. My father got out, I said, flatly. Not as confession, just as statement. He didn't say I know or I heard or anything that might have revealed advanced knowledge. He just looked at me, and the quality of his looking held all the things I didn't want easy comfort about. Are you all right? He asked. No, I said. Which was the most honest thing I'd said to him in all the months we'd been circling each other. Or possibly the most honest thing I'd said to anyone about anything in a long time. No, he agreed. Not echoing, not performing empathy. Just acknowledging. We sat there for a while. He ordered water. The bar was loud around us. I finished the third whiskey and didn't order a fourth, but I also didn't move to leave, and neither did he. At some point I said, I'm tired of being afraid. You're not afraid, he said. I am, I said. I'm afraid that it will start again. That he'll find her. That everything I've built won't be enough. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth for a moment. Gathered myself. I've been afraid of that since I was 15 years old, and I've been pretending I'm not for 13 years, and tonight I stopped. Tonight you're tired of pretending, he said. I looked at him across the table. At the stillness of him. At the dark eyes that held mine with such steady, undemanding focus. Something in me, some last held lock, released its tumbler. Come with me, he said. Quietly. Not commanding. The question beneath it entirely clear. I looked at him for a long moment. The whiskey and the grief and the long months of proximity and the shift that had been happening in me, incremental and unstoppable. Okay, I said. His apartment was in Gangnam, not the flashy architectural statement I might have expected from a man of his means, but a high-floor space that was spare and precisely ordered and, to my surprise, full of books. I registered this distantly. The shelves of them. The particular clutter of a serious reader. The city spread out below us through floor-to-ceiling windows, 100,000 lights scattered like constellations fallen and rearranged by human hands. I stood at the window and looked out at it. I heard him moving behind me, the soft sounds of a coat being set aside, a lamp being turned on somewhere in the room, the distant suggestion of music, something low and instrumental that I couldn't quite identify. Then he was beside me. Not behind me, not crowding. Beside. Looking out at the city too. Tell me to go home, I said, if you think I should go home. I think, he said, that you should stay exactly as long as you want to. I turned to look at him. His face in profile, lit by the city glow through the glass. The clean line of his jaw. The particular quality of him that I had been processing for months. The authority that wasn't aggression, the power that wasn't violence, the steadiness that wasn't coldness. I had been held together by vigilance for so long. So long. I reached out and turned his face toward me with 2 fingers against his jaw, the first time I had touched him in all these months, and I looked at him close up in the lamp and city light, and I thought, this is real. Whatever this is real. Sang-hoon, he said softly. Don't tell me to be careful, I said. I wouldn't, he said. I'm telling you I've got you. He had me. He came closer with the same quality as everything else he did, unhurried, intentional, giving me every moment to change my mind, and then his hands came up to frame my face with a gentleness that I felt in the backs of my eyes, and he pressed his forehead against mine, and we stood like that in the dark with the city below us, breathing the same air. Then he kissed me. Not the hungry, aggressive collision I might have braced for and wouldn't have known what to do with. Slow. Careful. The way you handle something precious. His lips were warm and the pressure of them was a question first, and then, when I answered it by pulling him closer by the lapel of his shirt, it became something else. Deeper, more searching, with an undertow that I could feel pulling at everything I'd stored away for years. He kissed me until my hands had moved from his lapel to his shoulders and then to the back of his neck, and until the last careful distance between us had closed entirely. When we broke apart, his breathing had changed. Mine too. You need to know, he said very quietly, very steadily, that whatever happens tonight and whatever happens after, I am not going anywhere. This is not a thing I take lightly. I know, I said. And I did know. The months of patience. The flowers I'd thrown away. The way he'd said what affects you matters to me. If at any point... Kim Dan, I said. I pulled back enough to look at him clearly. Stop talking. He smiled. Fully this time, not the restrained, contained version. The real one. And it was devastating. He found my hand with his. Led me toward the bedroom, the lamp behind us casting a long amber light across the floor. The bedroom was quiet. The music from the other room was a distant murmur. The city below threw its soft light through curtains that were almost but not entirely closed. He turned to me and his hands went to the collar of my shirt, not with haste, not with any edge of impatience, and slowly, button by careful button, he opened it, his eyes on mine throughout, checking, present, entirely here. He pushed the shirt from my shoulders. I had been looked at before, in the ring between the ropes, with crowds seeing every plane and angle of what I'd built myself into. But no one had ever looked at me the way Kim Dan looked at me in that quiet room. Like something he'd been waiting a long time to see. Like something extraordinary. He brought me down onto the bed with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything, and then he began to demonstrate exactly how much of the past months he had been paying attention. He started at my feet. I won't pretend the first touch of his lips against my instep didn't make me inhale sharply. He held my ankle with one hand and pressed his mouth to the arch of my foot and then worked upward. My ankle, my calf, the back of my knee, the particular sensitivity of the skin there that I had not previously known existed. He moved to my inner knee, the soft skin of it, and I felt every nerve in my body reorganizing itself around the path he was tracing. He moved to my lower thigh. His mouth against that stretch of skin was unhurried and thorough, the occasional press of his teeth the barest suggestion, the warmth of his breath preceding every touch so that anticipation became its own sensation. I heard myself make a sound I didn't fully recognize. Low, not my boxing voice, not my public voice, something private and undefended that I had not expected. Sang Hoon, he said against my skin, my name in his mouth like something he was tasting. Don't stop, I said. My own voice was unrecognizable. He didn't stop. Inner thigh. The warmth of his mouth there was maddening, careful and deliberate and absolutely aware of the effect it was having. My hands found the sheets. My eyes closed. The world had reduced itself to this dark room, this man, the specific and exquisite map he was drawing on my body. He reached my hip. My waist. He took his time there too, his hands spreading warmth across the planes of my abdomen, his mouth tracing the line of my ribs, my stomach, the divot of my navel. I was not, by any honest accounting, a man who was easily overwhelmed. I had trained myself to be in control in the most physically and emotionally extreme circumstances. I was good at that. I was not in control. You're so, he started against my skin. If you say beautiful I'll hit you, I managed. He laughed. A real one, low and warm and intimate. I felt it against my stomach. He moved upward. His mouth found my chest, the line of my sternum, then the particular attention of his lips against my left nipple that made my entire back arch despite every intention otherwise. He was thorough. He understood, with a precision that suggested either genuine intuition or paying extraordinary attention to my responses, and I suspected both, exactly how much and exactly how light and exactly how much pressure, and I stopped trying to manage my reactions because there was absolutely nothing to be done. His mouth moved to my collarbone, my neck. He pressed his lips to the pulse point there and I turned my head involuntarily to give him more access, an instinct I could neither explain nor govern, and he made a sound against my throat that was low and satisfied and meant specifically for me. He reached my jaw, my cheek, the corner of my mouth. I pulled him the rest of the way up and kissed him. What followed was not something I have words sufficient for. Not the words of my boxing commentary or my carefully maintained public persona or the internal voice I'd narrated my whole life with. What followed was made of entirely different material, vulnerability and warmth and the extraordinary disorienting discovery that being with someone could feel like coming home to a place you'd never been. Every time his body moved against mine with perfect, devastating precision, I said his name without meaning to. I said other things too, things that surprised me, unguarded things, honest things, the kinds of things that only come out when you finally let someone close enough to hear them. He held me through all of it. He kept his word, he had me. Entirely, completely, without conditions. Afterward he pulled me close against his chest and said quietly into my hair, "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," I said. My voice was raw but certain. "Not ever," he said. I said nothing to that for a moment. The city light came through the gap in the curtains. The music was still playing somewhere, barely audible. "I believe you," I said. And I did. I didn't entirely know what to do with the morning after. I woke before him, boxer's habit, my body clock indifferent to emotional upheaval, and lay in the gray-souled dawn watching him sleep with the particular awkwardness of a man who has surprised himself. His face in sleep was younger looking, more unguarded. The precise authority of his waking expression was absent. He just looked like a person. I lay there long enough to understand that I was not, despite the many logical arguments I had been making to myself for months, going to run. And then I got up and found the kitchen and made coffee because there is always coffee in Korean households and the coffee machine in Kim Dan's kitchen was the kind that required minor engineering certification to operate and I figured it out with the same focused determination I applied to everything. He appeared in the kitchen doorway 45 minutes later with the slightly abstracted look of someone still assembling themselves back into their daytime operating mode. I handed him a coffee. He took it, looked at me over the rim of it with those dark, calm eyes. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I said. We drank our coffees. The city noise came up from below. After a while he said, "Your mother?" and I looked at him. I've already had 2 men positioned near her building since last night. Discreet. She won't know they're there unless she needs them. I stared at him. You told me, he said, that your father was out. I told you once that when that happened I wanted to know. He held my gaze. I acted on what I knew. Something enormous moved through my chest. I stopped. Without asking me. I'm asking you now, he said. I'm telling you what I did and I'm asking if it's acceptable to you. I looked at him for a long, silent moment. The man who had spent months showing me, in the most patient and specific terms, exactly the kind of person he was. The man who had not taken anything I hadn't offered. The man who had spent the previous night making me understand what it felt like to be genuinely, entirely known. It's acceptable, I said. His face did something brief and controlled that I was learning to read as the equivalent, in anyone else, of something much more visible. Relief maybe. The particular satisfaction of a man who has done something he hoped would be received well. Thank you, I said. And I meant it from a place so deep it was almost unlocatable. We spent the day together. It was a Sunday. We went nowhere significant. A walk, a quiet lunch at a place he knew, the particular ease of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other and arrived, somehow, at just being. When I left in the evening he kissed me goodbye at the door with the warmth and certainty of a man who fully intends to see me again and fully expects me to feel the same. I walked to my car thinking, I'm in trouble. But the good kind. The terrifying and clarifying and entirely unfamiliar good kind. In the following weeks things shifted. We spent more time together. It was not always easy. I was training toward my next title defense. He had his operations and the opacity of what some of those operations involved was a thing I chose not to examine too closely, a pragmatic decision I made with my eyes open, but we navigated the edges of our 2 very different worlds with the care of people who have decided the other person is worth the effort. And then, 4 weeks after that night, the pain started. I want to be very clear about this. I am a professional athlete. I know my body with the intimacy that professional athletics demands. I know every pain, every ache, the way different muscles respond to different loads, the particular language of physical distress that distinguishes injury from training soreness from illness. I know my body. Which is why the pain confused me so badly. It started as a low, persistent ache in my lower abdomen. The kind of ache that, if you are a person with certain biological configurations, might be immediately identifiable. For me it was simply anomalous. I tracked it over 3 days, certain it was some training-related strain I hadn't registered. By the 4th day it had become something that could not be attributed to training. By the 5th day I went to the hospital. I went to the sports medicine clinic I regularly used. Dr. Lim, who had treated various fight injuries over the years and who knew my body's baseline as well as anyone. I described the symptoms. He ran the standard checks. And then he went quiet in the particular way that doctors go quiet when they're looking at something they weren't expecting. Sang-hoon, he said carefully, I need to ask you some questions. He asked them. I answered them honestly, which meant answering about Kim Dan without elaborating on anything that felt private. Dr. Lim listened without visible reaction, which I appreciated. Then he said he wanted to run a specific test. I agreed. The test came back 30 minutes later. Dr. Lim sat across from me in the small examination room and said, with the particular precision of a man choosing every word, Sang-hoon, you're pregnant. I looked at him. I'm sorry, I said. Say that again. The HCG levels are very clear, he said. You are, by the readings, approximately 4 weeks along. I'm an alpha, I said. I know, he said. I'm an alpha, I said again as though repetition would make the logic work differently. Yes, he said. And in standard cases that would make this impossible. But standard cases don't apply when, he paused, choosing his words carefully, when the other partner is an enigma. I sat with that for a moment. Enigmas, he said, with the delicacy of a man covering well-established theoretical ground that has suddenly become very practical, are not subject to the biological limitations that govern alpha-omega dynamics. Their phenomenal chemistry is categorically different. In documented cases, very few historically, the pairing of an enigma with an alpha can result in biological changes in the alpha that allow for pregnancy. It's not common. It's rare enough that most physicians would never see it in a career. He looked at me steadily. I'm looking at it now. Is it? I stopped. Is it dangerous? The pregnancy itself presents some challenges, he said. Your body wasn't designed for this configuration. The pains you're experiencing are your system adjusting. That adjustment period can be difficult. With careful monitoring, good support, and, he cleared his throat slightly, with regular contact with your partner whose pheromones will help stabilize your body's processes, there's every reason to expect a healthy outcome. I sat in that examination room for a long time after he finished talking. Long enough that the nurse knocked on the door twice to check that I was all right. I was not sure that I was all right. I was also, somewhere beneath the shock and the logistical impossibility of the situation and the very real fear about my physical health, aware of something else entirely. A warmth. Small and quiet and completely irrational. A warmth that I would not name yet because I wasn't ready. I drove to Kim Dan's apartment. It was a Tuesday afternoon. He opened the door when I knocked and looked at my face and said nothing, just stepped aside and let me in. I sat on his couch. He sat in the chair across from me. He waited. "I'm pregnant," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched his face. I had become reasonably good at reading Kim Dan's face, the minute calibrations of his expression, the way information registered in his eyes before any more visible response arrived. What I saw in those 4 seconds was shock, which he controlled almost immediately. Then something else. Something that moved through his eyes like a tide. "Tell me what you need," he said. His voice was absolutely steady. "At this exact moment," I said, "I need you to say something that tells me you're not going to disappear." He stood, crossed the room, sat beside me on the couch, took my hand in both of his. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I told you that. I meant it then and I mean it with every possible additional weight it carries now." I looked at our joined hands. My hand, the boxer's hand, the scarred knuckles, the evidence of everything I'd built, held in both of his. "How?" I said. And I wasn't asking how in the reproductive biology sense. I was asking the larger how. How did we get here? How is this my life? "I told you I wasn't an alpha," he said. There was the ghost of that smile, the restrained one. "You never quite believed me." "I believe you now," I said. "Pregnancy, I discovered, is not something that makes a truce with boxing. I retired from active competition the moment I confirmed the results. Not a decision I agonized over because there was no version of responsible parenthood in which I continued taking punches to my body while carrying a child, and I am, whatever else I am, a responsible person." Coach Beck took the news with the same economy of reaction he applied to everything, said, "Right," and asked if I needed anything. "I'll need to train differently," I said. "Keep the conditioning without the contact." "We'll manage," he said. "I'll be back," I said. "After." "I know," he said. And then, almost as an afterthought, "You're going to be a remarkable father." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. Kim Dan was, in the pregnancy as in everything, constant. Not hovering, he understood instinctively that I did not want to be hovered over, that I needed to feel capable and functional and in possession of my own agency. But he was there. Every day in some form. At my apartment in the mornings, at his own in the evenings when I stayed over, at doctor's appointments that he attended with the absolute presence of someone for whom this was the most important thing in his current calendar. Dr. Lim monitored me closely. The early months were the hardest. The pain was real and it was significant, my body protesting the impossible configuration it had been put in. I fainted twice. Once in the kitchen of my apartment, reaching for something on a high shelf, and once at the gym, which was embarrassing in the particular way that any public display of vulnerability is embarrassing when you've spent your adult life curating an image of physical invincibility. Kim Dan was there both times. The first time he caught me before I hit the floor, his reflexes having the particular quality of a man who had spent his career staying ready for unexpected events. The second time he arrived at the gym within 15 minutes of being called, with the particular expression of controlled urgency that I had come to recognize as the version of fear he allowed himself in public. He held my hand in the car on the way home from the gym and I let him, which was significant. I am not a man who easily accepts being taken care of, the years of being the one who did the taking care having made the reversal feel strange and slightly vulnerable. But I let him. Because Dr. Lim had said the pheromones helped, and they did, something in the specific chemistry of his closeness made the pain recede slightly, made my body settle, and because, if I was being honest with myself, I had stopped pretending that needing something from Kim Dan was weakness. "Stop trying to look fine," he said once in the 4th month, when I was sitting at his kitchen table at 7 in the morning with the carefully neutral expression I defaulted to when the pain was present and I didn't want to make it visible. "I'm fine," I said. "Sang-hoon," he said. I looked at him. He was leaning against the kitchen counter in the morning light, his own coffee in hand, watching me with those steady eyes. No impatience. No judgment. Just the willingness to see whatever was actually there. "It hurts," I said. "I know," he said. "I don't like it," I said. "I know," he said again. "I'm not used to," I stopped. "Not being in control of your body," he said. "Yes." I looked at the table. My body has always been mine. I built it. I trained it. I know every part of it. And now it's doing something entirely independent of anything I planned or chose, and I turned my coffee cup in my hands. It makes me feel like I'm 15 again and something is happening that I can't stop. He set down his cup and came to where I was sitting and crouched down in front of me so we were at eye level. He took my face in his hands, that gesture that I had come to understand as one of his most genuine, the one he used when he needed me to receive something fully. You chose this, he said. You're choosing it every day. That's not helplessness. That's courage. I breathed. The pain in my abdomen was a steady, distant thing, manageable in the morning compared to what it was in the evenings. You're insufferably good at saying the right thing, I said. One of my better qualities, he agreed. I pulled him up and kissed him, and he kissed me back with the warmth and steadiness that I had, somewhere in the preceding months, stopped being able to imagine being without. My father came to my mother's flower shop on a Thursday afternoon in my 6th month. I knew about it 6 minutes after it happened, because Kim Dan's men were positioned near the building and had been since the day of his release, and they called in the moment Park Dong-soo appeared on the street outside. I was at Kim Dan's at the time. It had become the natural base of operations for both of us, though my apartment still stood and my mother didn't know the specifics of our arrangement, and I was on my feet the moment the call came in. Kim Dan's hand was on my arm. Your mother is safe, he said. The report had said she was inside, that his men had moved to a position that would intercept before entry was possible. She's safe. He's there, I said. I know. His voice was level. Let my men handle the street. I will handle Park Dong-soo. I looked at him. The thing inside me, the 15-year-old who'd made the vow, who'd built himself from that vow up, said I should be the one. 13 years of training for exactly this. My mother, my promise, my responsibility. Sang-hoon, Kim Dan said. You're 6 months pregnant with our child. You are not going anywhere near this man tonight. That's my mother, I said. I know, he said. And she will be safe. I give you my word. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, with the total absence of performance, the weight of a man who means precisely what he says and understands that words are contracts. I sat down. It was the hardest sitting down I have ever done. What happened that night, Kim Dan never told me in full detail. I got a report from his men that my father had been intercepted outside the shop, that my mother had not seen him, that he had been removed from the area. I heard, through fragments that reached me over the following days via the networks of information that surrounded Kim Dan like atmosphere, that Park Dong-soo had been given a very clear accounting, in the particular register that Kim Dan used when he wanted to communicate something that could not be misunderstood, of what would happen if he came near Park Young-sun, Choi Sang-hoon, or anyone connected to either of them, at any point in the future. My father did not come back. Not then. Not ever after. I did not ask for the specifics of what was said or done. I made that choice consciously. And I found, to my mild self-astonishment, that I was at peace with it. The version of justice available through formal channels had failed my mother for most of my childhood. The version Kim Dan provided was less elegant and significantly less legal, but it was, in the plainest terms, effective. I went to my mother's shop the next morning. She was behind the counter, arranging a basket of white chrysanthemums with the focused attention she gave to all her flowers, and she looked up when I came in and smiled her full smile, the sun from behind buildings smile, and said, Sang-hoon, you look terrible. I'm 6 months pregnant, I said. I'm allowed to look terrible. She set down the chrysanthemums. Her expression had moved through several things very quickly. The smile, then the knowledge of what I just said, then the kind of careful blankness that means a person is processing something large. Sit down, I said. I need to tell you some things. We sat in the back room of the shop among the smell of cut flowers and earth and the particular sweetness of her herbal tea. I told her about Kim Dan. Not everything. Some things are private, and my mother is a woman of discretion who would be the first to tell me she doesn't need every detail of her adult son's life. But I told her the important things. I told her about who he was and what he'd become to me. I told her about the pregnancy, which I had been waiting to tell her until I was sure of myself, sure of him, sure that I was ready to say it out loud to the person whose opinion mattered most to me. She sat very still through all of it, listening in the way she'd always listened to me, with her full attention and without the reflexive commentary that other parents used as a defense against difficult information. When I was done, she was quiet for a long moment. Is he good to you? She asked. Yes, I said. Is he, she paused, looking for the right word, someone you trust? Yes, I said. And I meant it at a depth I hadn't meant many things before. She nodded slowly. Then she reached across the table and took my hand and said, Then bring him to meet me. I called Kim Dan from outside the shop. He picked up on the second ring. My mother wants to meet you, I said. A brief silence. Then, when? Sunday, I said. Lunch. I'll be there, he said. And then softer, how are you feeling? Better, I said. I was standing in the spring morning outside my mother's flower shop, the smell of blossoms in the air, my mother inside with her chrysanthemums and her quiet strength, my father a neutralized threat in the rearview mirror of my life for perhaps the first time. Better than I've felt in a long time. The months passed in the particular way that large, irreversible things pass. Enormously slowly in the experience and incomprehensibly quickly in retrospect. Summer deepened into the kind of soul heat that made training impossible between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. My body changed in ways that continue to astonish me, both in the physical reality of the changes and in the complicated emotional territory they opened up. The alpha in me periodically at war with the creature comfort softness of what was happening, the former champion's body housing something entirely new and dependent and vulnerable, and the gradual, grudging, genuine acceptance of that. Kim Dan was extraordinary in these months. He was patient with my rages, because there were rages, the hormonal chemistry of this impossibly strange pregnancy doing things to my emotional regulation that I found deeply undignified and he found, apparently, entirely manageable. He would stand in the kitchen while I catalogued his various flaws at considerable volume and wait until I was done and then hand me whatever I'd been about to reach for before the frustration overwhelmed me and say quietly, "Better?" And I would say something ungracious and take the offered item and 5 minutes later the storm would have passed and I would find him exactly where he'd been, unhurried and unruffled, as though he hadn't just weathered something that would have driven a less patient person to the door. "You're not normal," I told him once in the 7th month post-rage sitting side by side on his couch with my feet, which had begun to swell in the evenings, a development I found personally offensive, in his lap, where he was doing that thing with his thumbs that helped. "I've been told," he said. A normal person would have said something back. "Nothing you said was untrue," he observed. "That's not the point. The point is I was yelling at you for 20 minutes. 15, he said. "You were counting?" "I was not counting," he said. He looked up at me with the warm half-amusement that I had come to understand was the specific expression he reserved for situations where I was being unreasonable, and he found it endearing rather than frustrating. I was listening. I looked at him. The lamp on the side table. The books on the shelves behind him. The city beyond the window, early evening, the sky that deep blue that Seoul did in late summer. "I love you," I said. I had not said it before. I had known it, or known something that carried all the weight of the word without the word itself, for months. But I had not said it. The particular armor of a person who has spent years governing exactly what they give away does not unarm easily. He stopped moving his thumbs. He looked at me. "Sang-hoon," he said. "Don't say anything," I said. "Or say it back, one of those." "I love you," he said. And his voice carried every month of patience, every quiet coffee in the morning, every time he'd said "I've got you" and meant it entirely. I pressed my lips together for a moment. Then I looked back at the window. "Right," I said. His hands resumed their work on my feet. The city went gold outside. Our son was born on the first day of October, on a morning that came in cold and bright and clear after days of gray. The labor was long. My body, which had carried the whole pregnancy with the particular difficulty of a system doing something it was not anatomically intended for, communicated its displeasure during the process with what I can only describe as significant force. Kim Dan was there for all of it, holding my hand or my shoulder, or simply being present in the room with the quality of presence that had been his constant offering from the beginning. Steady, unflinching here. I will not pretend that I did not, at some point in the very worst of it, say things to him that were not generous. I will say that he received them with the same equanimity he received everything, and that when it was over and they placed our son in my arms, this small, complete, astonishing creature, the first thing Kim Dan did was press his lips to my forehead and say very quietly, "You were extraordinary." I held our son. He was so small. He had Kim Dan's nose, I thought immediately, or maybe I was imagining it, maybe it was too early to see those things. He had my coloring, the pale skin, the dark hair. He was entirely himself. Already himself in the way of newborns who arrive complete. I looked at him and I thought of every boxing match I'd ever won. Every title. Every night in the gym when 15-year-old Choi Sang-hoon had refused to stop, refused to be less than what he needed to become, refused to let fear or grief or the wounds his father had cut into the world define what he could do with what he'd been given. I had been building toward this. Not consciously, not with this specific destination in mind, but the trajectory was clear now in retrospect. All of it, the gym, the fights, the champion's belt, the man I'd made myself into, had been a road. Kim Dan sat beside me on the narrow hospital bed, his arm around both of us, looking at our son with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not the composed authority. Not the warm containment. Something entirely open. Something I recognized as the thing he'd been carrying for months that he had not, in his characteristic restraint, allowed to fully surface until there was something to surface for. What shall we call him? I asked. Kim Dan was quiet for a moment. Then, you choose. I looked at him. This is your child too. I know, he said. I trust you. I looked at our son. Kang Dan. I said quietly to the small sleeping face. Is that you? Our son made a small sound. Not a cry. Something more like acknowledgement. Kang Dan, Kim Dan said softly. Kim Kang Dan. Park Yong-sun will have opinions about the surname, I said. I expect she will, he said. He looked at me. Let's discuss it over the next 18 years. I smiled. And he leaned in and pressed a slow, warm, deliberate kiss to my temple and then to my cheek, and his hand came up to cradle the back of my head, and I turned my face and found his mouth and we kissed in the early October morning light with our son sleeping between us, unhurried and certain, the kind of kiss that has nowhere to go and no one to perform for and exists simply as what it is. A reaffirmation. A renewing. A daily choosing. I am here. You are here. This is ours. 6 months later. The training room of the Choi Kim Gym, which was what the boxing world had taken to calling it, less formally, when the news broke that Kim Dan had co-funded the renovation of Coach Beck's Incheon facility, smelled exactly as it always had. Sweat, leather, effort, possibility. I was back in training. Slowly. Carefully. Under Coach Beck's supervision and Dr. Lim's sign-off, building back toward the body I'd had, finding the new version of it, changed by what I'd carried and delivered, different in some respects, the same in others, perhaps more itself in certain ways for having been through the impossible. My title would need defending eventually. I knew that. There were conversations happening between Coach Beck and the Federation, between Kim Dan's sports lawyers, and various promoters about the when and how of Choi Sang-hoon's return to the professional ring. I had opinions about those timelines. But that morning, in the quiet of the early training session before the gym opened to the full roster, I was working the bag with the focused simplicity I had always loved about it. Just the bag. Just the movement. Just the thinking with my hands. Kim Dan came in at 7:45, he'd taken Kang Dan to drop at my mother's shop for the morning, a Thursday ritual that had established itself in the weeks since we'd introduced them. My mother and our son had achieved an immediate and unshakable mutual devotion, and he stood at the edge of the gym watching me the way he had on the very first day he'd come here. With that particular quality of attention. Present and still and entirely here. I finished the combination. Stepped back. Looked at him. How did he do? I asked. Screamed at the dahlias for 10 minutes, Kim Dan said. Your mother found this very amusing. He's his father's son, I said. Both of us. Kim Dan's mouth curved. He came across the gym floor toward me, unhurried in the way that was entirely him, and took my gloved hand in his and turned it over. How do you feel? He asked. Good, I said. And it was true, not the managed version of fine, not the performance of strength, but genuinely, practically good. My body was mine again, familiar under me, responding to training with the muscle memory of a decade and a half of dedication. My mother was well. Kang Dan was 6 months old and loudly opinionated and had begun, over the past 2 weeks, to smile specifically at Kim Dan in a way that was clearly calculated and extremely effective. My father was a ghost in the far distance of my life, neutralized and irrelevant. Good, Kim Dan echoed. He looked at me steadily. There's something I want to ask you. I raised my eyebrows. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small box. The kind of small box that requires no explanation, that has been communicating its contents through sheer small boxness since before any of us were alive. I stared at it. Kim Dan, I said. I know, he said. I know what you're going to say. I was going to say you picked a strange place, I said. You love this gym, he said. I wanted to ask you somewhere you love. I looked at the box. At him. At the composed, unhurried face of the man who had pursued me across months with the patience of mountains, who had held me through the night of my father's release and the long months of the impossible pregnancy and the first terrifying, extraordinary morning of fatherhood, who had positioned men to guard my mother without being asked and held my hand through rages and labor and the quiet mornings of becoming something neither of us had fully planned. I already told you I loved you, I said. You told me once, he said. I'm asking you to make it a little harder to take back. I shook my head slowly. You're impossible. You've said that before, he observed. I keep meaning it differently. He opened the box. Simple band, dark metal, unornamented. He knew me. I pulled off my glove. Held out my hand. He slid the ring onto my finger and looked up at me with those deep, still, warm eyes. Sang-hoon, he said. And in his voice was everything. The night at the river, the flowers I'd thrown away, the first morning coffee, the hospital room, the October morning with our son. Yes, I said. Before he could finish the question. Yes, and don't make me say it twice. He stood and kissed me there in the gym in the morning light, with the smell of leather and effort around us and the sound of the city waking up outside. I kissed him back. Later, my mother cried happy tears over the ring and fed me 3 separate things because she always fed me when she was emotional. Coach Beck shook Kim Dan's hand for a long time and said, gruffly, that he'd known from the beginning. Kang Dan ate a chrysanthemum petal that my mother rescued from his mouth just in time and was entirely unrepentant about it. Kim Dan held our son and looked at me from across my mother's small flower shop, amid the smell of flowers and earth and the particular sweetness of her herbal tea, and smiled. And I thought, here it is. The thing I built toward without knowing that's what I was building toward. The promise kept and then exceeded. The room where nobody is afraid. The home I never had and then had after all, by my own hands and with the extraordinary, impossible, particular help of the man across the room from me. I thought, my father is not in this room. He is not in this city in any meaningful sense. He is a thing that happened to me and that I survived and that I have, somehow, alchemized, through years and labor and love, into something that produced this house full of flowers. This woman who raised me. This man who stayed. This child who screamed at dahlias and laughed at nothing and was, in his small complete existence, the most astonishing thing I had ever made. I am Choi Sang-hoon. I am 28 years old. I am a boxing champion and a father and a man engaged to be married to the most infuriating and extraordinary person I have ever encountered. I grew up in a home full of fear and I built, from the materials I had, something entirely different. My father taught me what I didn't want to be. Kim Dan showed me what I could be if I let myself. And Kang Dan, our son, this impossible, wonderful boy, is the proof that what seemed broken can, given enough time and enough love and enough stubbornness, become something no one could have predicted. The ring is on my finger. The flowers are in the vase. My mother is laughing. Kim Dan is looking at me from across the room. I look back. I've got you, he said once. He does.